The Cold War was a long and drawn-out war that lasted most of the second half of the 20th century, from 1945 to 1991. Any war lasting this long, you could expect effects to take place on the country fighting in it. This war directly affected the hysteria of America itself. The Cold War was a fight between the Soviet Union and America based on the spread of communism, this being a weapon used by the Soviets to tear down liberal idealism. After World War II, the Soviets occupied Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and worked to influence many more. As a result, these countries fell under Soviet influence due to some psychological control using their sphere of influence method, and the USSR established Soviet-style communist governments in these countries known as the Soviet bloc. Taking notice to this, the United States and Western European allies formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, due to rising concerns about expansion. In response to this, the Soviet Union formalized military relations with the Soviet bloc through what was known as the Warsaw Pact. Through this Warsaw Pact, the USSR was able to promote communism in third world countries, thus causing the beginning of what we know today as the Cold War.
As poverty and starvation spread, chaos threatened to overwhelm the Western democracies. Some feared the election of communist governments. Others, Stalin and the Red Army. When the war ended, the president, like most Americans, had clung to the hope that Stalin would not impose communism on Eastern Europe. But Truman's optimism dwindled as he saw Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, East Germany fall behind a communist Iron Curtain.
The Cold War can be viewed to have started at the Potsdam Conference. The viewpoints between the three leaders of Truman, Churchill, and Stalin for the most part clashed and created conflict, which eventually can be traced back to the start of the war. The meeting at Potsdam was the third conference between the leaders of the Big Three nations. At the Potsdam meeting, the most pressing issue was the post-war fate of Germany. The Soviets wanted a unified Germany, but they also insisted that Germany be completely disarmed. Truman, along with a growing number of U.S. officials, had deep suspicions about Soviet intentions in Europe. In response to President Truman's speech, The Truman Doctrine, Lassalle stated, "We're not sorry to see the Americans take their place, although their desire for friendship with Russia remains strong." Le Libre Belgique remarked that the American imperialism was no worse. Indeed, it was rather objectionable. This showed a divided opinion between viewpoints of the leaders and their countries. The Potsdam Conference ended on a somber note. By the time it was over, Truman had become even more convinced that he had to adopt a tough policy towards the Soviets. Stalin had to believe more strongly that the United States and Great Britain were conspiring against the Soviet Union. The American culture was impacted in many different ways due to the Cold War arms race. One way the Cold War arms race influenced American culture was the Red Scare. The Red Scare created a hysteria that affected the daily lives of American citizens. Communism was spreading and Americans were worried that the Reds would soon take control. The main concern was that if the Soviet Union gained control, they would try to bring communism into the United States. From this, McCarthyism was founded. Joseph McCarthy was a first-term senator from Wisconsin who was also an anti-communist. He wanted to find the secret members of the Communist Party that were working in the government. McCarthy gave a speech at the Women's Republican Club in West Virginia. He declared that he had a list with 205 names of the members in the Communist Party that were all working in the State Department. In the next month, an investigation was started by the Senate subcommittee. The investigators found no evidence of any communists working in the State Department. McCarthy called his actions the Red Baiting Campaign. He was put in charge of a committee on government operations which enabled him to lead even more investigations. After all the investigations and hearings, no evidence was found and McCarthy lost his power. He also caused over 2,000 government employees to lose their jobs. McCarthyism created a fear that if anyone disagreed with his political views, they would be prosecuted to lose their jobs. Lastly, the atomic bombs also had a strong effect on the American culture. The threat of the atomic bombs terrified the people in America. No one knew how long it would be before the Soviet Union would drop their bombs, which intensified the hysteria. New safety drills such as duck and cover were being taught in schools in case a bomb was dropped. Also, underground bunkers and fallout shelters were built for protection. America was unsure of when the bombs would come or if they would, but America knew the bombs were extremely dangerous and deadly. Truman's containment policy was the first major policy during the Cold War and used numerous strategies to prevent the spread of communism. This policy was a response to the moves by the Soviet Union to enlarge its communist sphere of influence in Eastern Europe China, Korea, and Vietnam. As World War II grew to a close, key State Department personnel grew suspicious of the Soviets. Averell Harriman, a U.S. ambassador in Moscow, witnessed and astonished at the 1944 Soviet betrayal of the Warsaw Uprising. Harriman played an important role in influencing Truman's views on the Soviet Union. The U.S. State Department asked George F. Kennan of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow why the Russians opposed the idea of the creation of World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, ideas which provided loans to countries of the world for capital loans. Kennan had told them, the Soviets perceived themselves to be in a state of perpetual war with capitalism. The Soviets would use controllable Marxists in the capitalist world as allies. Soviet aggression was not aligned with the views of the Russian people or with economic reality, but with historic Russian xenophobia and paranoia. The Soviet government's structure prevented objective or accurate pictures of an internal and external reality. This was known as the Long Telegram. Clark Clifford and George Elsey created a report elaborating on this and produced concrete policy recommendations based on its analysis. It recommended restraining and confining Soviet influence and was presented to Truman on September 24, 1946. In 1991, the Cold War grew to a close with the dissolvement of the Soviet Union and the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. It's important to remember that the Cold War approached us only after World War II, and Americans were already greatly in distress and traumatization. American governments faced a great deal in fighting to stop the spread of a communist superpower. American officials greatly feared for another German-like outbreak for power, which is why it was so essential to them to find as many ways as possible to restrict such power from the USSR, using their policies of containment. The Cold War left a lash on American citizens in times of crisis for good, with protests of war spurring in streets, families protecting to shield themselves from bombs, and the market world working its way around times of depression. It taught America how to strengthen in times of crisis and come back from hysteric times, and through this America only came out on top as more powerful.